The Lord be with you. Come, let us make all things right. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus spoke the following parable to some people who prided themselves on being virtuous and despised everyone else. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood there and said this prayer to himself: I thank you, God, that I am not grasping, unjust, adulterous like the rest of humankind, and particularly that I am not like this tax collector here. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on all I get. The tax collector stood some distance away, not daring even to raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This man, I tell you, went home again at right with God. The other did not. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but a man who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In today's Gospel, there is nothing really, if you go to what is happening, there is nothing really wrong about the Pharisee and what he says about himself. And it is maybe true that what he says is, it is true that what he says is what is happening. That he fasts twice a week, that he is not adulterous, he is not unjust, he is doing everything right. And that possibly he is not like the tax collector. That is also true, because the tax collectors were considered sinners. The tax collectors were considered not generous to people. They were considered strict and sinners. So it is possibly true, but there is something really wrong about him. And that thing is pride. It's pride. Actually, the gospel says that he makes this prayer to himself. He doesn't make the prayer to God. The tax collector the Pharisee makes the prayer to himself and says, this is what I am. And this is the image that he places before God. One of the sins, one of the greatest of all sins that God really hates and despises is the sin of idolatry. When people begin to choose other things to him. When people choose other gods instead of him. And this is the first sin of the people of Israel when they made a golden calf just at the foot of Mount Sinai. God was really angry and he continually reminded them, please do not yield to idolatry. And what led the people into exile, into slavery, into much suffering is because of the sin of idolatry. Especially when Solomon took over power, became king, he made shrines for the people, for his own people, because he married many wives from the surrounding nations. And these wives started to persuade him to make shrines for their own gods. And this is what God warns them against. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 7, he said, when you go into the promised land, do not marry from them. Do not marry their daughters, and do not give your sons to marry, because they are going to convince you, they are going to persuade you to begin to worship their gods. So that tells you how much God hates idolatry. But the greatest form of idolatry that we find today is not actually the worship of statues or the worship of other gods, but the worship of the self, the worship of the ego. When we begin to see ourselves as God, when we begin to see ourselves as the model, when we begin to see ourselves as perfect, when we see ourselves as not needing anything again. And this is the exact sin of the Pharisee. Not that he was not doing the right thing, not that he was not fasting, not that he was not avoiding sin. He was doing all those things. But more greatly, he was doing all those things, but what he failed to do was to give allegiance to God. What he failed to do was to worship God. He was worshiping himself. He was making prayers to himself. And this is what many of us might be victims of. In one way or another, we always place ourselves before others. In one way or another, we always compare ourselves to others and we say we are better off than others. And at times, even when we sin, we justify ourselves and say, no, other people are doing worse things than us. And we always try to put us as the model. We always try to put the self as the if you want, the standard on which everything what everything should follow, the principle of everything. And this is really what the Pharisee did. And this is what God hates. The book of the first letter of St. Peter, chapter 5, verse 5 and 10, reminds us, God hates, he hates the proud and he exalts the lowly. And now on the other hand, we find the tax collector who comes and he stands not in front of the altar, but at the back because he realizes he is not worthy to be in God's presence. He stands very far away from the Holy of Holies. He takes the back position, he takes the unworthy position, and he stands there and he would not even dare to look up to God. But he said, he hit his chest and he said, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Lord, I am not worthy. Lord, I have broken your laws. Lord, I am sinful. I do not deserve your mercy. But he says, have mercy on me, a sinner. It is only when we acknowledge that we are unworthy, it is only when we acknowledge that we are sinful, when we acknowledge that by ourselves we can do nothing, then we have a want for God. It is only when we acknowledge that we are lacking by our own self. It's not by power, it's not by might, it's not by our own power, it's not by our own might. Then we begin to depend on God. And it is when we begin to depend on God that then he begins to manifest himself to us. It is only when we depend on God then we can say that we are worshiping the true God. We are worshiping one God on whom we depend for mercy, for love, for goodness, for everything that we need in this life. My dear brothers and sisters, it is a call for each and every one of us. The first commandment of God, which he gave to Moses in Exodus chapter 20, he says, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no God except me. We can only worship this God if we depend on him for mercy, for love, for everything. It is only when we do not depend on ourselves, when we do not make ourselves the model, when we do not make ourselves the principle, when we do not make ourselves the standard, then we realize that we depend on God. And when we depend on God, then he can begin to do great things for us. Let us remind ourselves of the last words of this gospel. God, anyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and anyone who humbles himself will be exalted.